I'm Craig Abbott. I'm the head of accessibility for digital at DWP. This talk's kind of, it's standards and strategy. It's kind of embedding accessibility at scale, but I think probably a more fitting talk sort of title for the talk is probably just doing some good stuff, but kind of ultimately winging it. I've took on the role of head of accessibility at DWP in March 2020. So I've been in the role for about 2 years now. And to be honest, when I first started, it was kind of like head of pretty much nothing. When I sort of joined DWP, well, I've been in DWP for a while, but when I moved into this role, we didn't have any dedicated accessibility roles. We didn't really have a kind of concrete handle on governance. There was a whole bunch of stuff which was missing. So although it was head of accessibility, it wasn't really head of a lot. There wasn't really much stuff to look after at that point. There was, like I said, there was no dedicated roles. There was no teams looking at compliance, and we kind of didn't have any concrete governance processes. So it was very much just kind of walking into an empty room and sort of saying, yes, I'm head of all of this stuff. So the first thing that I had to do was to try and understand the starting position. And I think that seems to be one of the challenges for a lot of large organizations, across government. Everyone seemed to be in the same boat and just trying to figure out where are we actually starting from. DWP did have some processes outlined, but they were really complex and nobody was really checking if the teams were actually following it. The process as well was named DAC, which was quite confusing. It stood for Digital Accessibility Compliance. And that was kind of an unfortunate accident, as the Digital Accessibility Center, where everyone goes for third-party audits, also gets called DAC. So there was just people talking about the DAC and people talking about DACs, and everything was kind of getting confused. So that was a kind of another unfortunate accident which happened when they were coming up with the existing process. The DAC process, the DWP DAC forms, it was made up of 23 different. They were mainly spreadsheets. There was 23 different ones, and they all served a different purpose. For example, a DAC 3 is a WCAG 2.1 checklist. So it has the 50 criteria in there, and you've got to kind of go down and say whether your service meets all of the different criteria. A DAC 9 is assistive technology script. So you do the same thing. You go through your service with JAWS and you kind of mark off all of the different sort of rows in the column. Then a DAC 27 is where you put all of the evidence from the DAC 3 and the DAC 9, and there's just a whole bunch of different things, and it does get quite confusing. But they predominantly fall into 3 categories. So of those 23 DAC forms, there was stuff that you needed to fill in, stuff that you needed to copy and paste from one spreadsheet into another, and stuff which only applied to non-browser based applications. So a few of those DAC forms are purely for things like EN 301, 549. It wasn't applying to the public sector bodies' accessibility regulations. The relationship between the forms, like I was just saying, was really complex. So for example, a DAC 3 might feed into a DAC 48, and then the DAC 48, the DAC 9, and the DAC 9A would all feed into the DAC 27. And this whole relationship between the forms just was a bit of a minefield. It took me a long time when I landed in the role, going through it all and actually trying to understand where all of the connections were. Even for somebody that kind of understands accessibility regulations and understands WCAG and that kind of thing, it was really difficult for me to put together what was actually kind of going on in this process. This is an example of one of the things that was written in one of the DAC forms. So it says, copy cells D14 to E33 from the Dragon worksheet of the DAC 9 and paste them into cell C12 onwards in this worksheet. Copy and paste the comments text from any test which failed into the relevant cells in the summary worksheet, editing as necessary. So you are literally having to copy and paste from one spreadsheet into another and then try and follow instructions like this to fill in the forms correctly. There was also one of the forms, one of the DAC forms was literally a copy and paste of the GDS accessibility statement template. So I don't know what, I still haven't fully understood why this was kind of pulled into a spreadsheet. I can only assume that HTML wasn't spreadsheety enough for civil service or something. But the problem with doing this as well is this GDS template was from July 2019. So if people were to pull this down and then use this form, they're actually using like out of date accessibility statements as well. So there was some kind of weird anomalies like this as well. And then we had the infamous DAC 39, which was a form where senior stakeholders could accept the risk and sign off on the service being accessible. So we had a lot of services where a senior stakeholder had basically filled in this DAC 39 form, which just said it doesn't need to be accessible because I said so, which is, I think in fairness, I don't know if the senior stakeholders were aware that they were signing off on something which was a legislative requirement at the time, but there was this DAC 39, which was kind of seen as a loophole. And the problem was then is you were then marked as being compliant if a senior stakeholder had accepted the risk, when actually you weren't compliant with the regulations, you were just compliant with a flawed process. Our intranet guidance was also a bit of a maze. There was a whole bunch of different pages. They all kind of looped around and sent you in circles. So trying to find out what you were looking for was actually quite difficult. There was some stuff on accessibility standards. Then there was some stuff on accessibility legislation, and the two kind of weren't connected up. Then there was WCAG 2.1 explained, which was a copy and paste of the actual WCAG 2.1 documentation. So again, it was just duplicating stuff which already existed, and the whole thing became a bit of a convoluted maze to navigate. So in a nutshell, our teams all struggled to follow the process, but a lot of them didn't even know if their service was in scope of the regulations anyway. So the process was really complex. People failed to navigate it, but a lot of teams weren't even engaging with it because they just didn't know that they had to do stuff. And if the process looks too hard, they just cut the corner and didn't bother doing it. And because nobody followed the process, because nobody was in charge of the process, and because nobody was kind of checking that people were doing this work, we didn't really have a way of monitoring or reporting what was in scope, which one of our services, it applied to, what was compliant, and if it wasn't compliant, how far away was it? There was no road mapping to compliance, none of that stuff. And when I first came in sort of 2 years ago, an initial estimate put our compliance rate at around about 5%. It turned out to be about 7% when we did actually do all of the work to figure it out. But it was around 7%. And that was based purely on the teams that had managed to get through that process. And it actually just kind of knuckled down and did it, despite the fact that it was quite complicated. So starting from scratch, we kind of had to find a better way of doing this, because it obviously wasn't working, the stuff that we were doing. So the first thing I had to do was actually figure out what services we had and what services were in scope. And I don't know if this is solely a DWP problem, but we didn't even know which services we had. There was a whole bunch of people had built things. There was a whole bunch of like legacy systems. And when I was I was like, somebody somewhere must have a list of all of the services that we have. And sort of I ended up with 3 different ones that were apparently the source of truth, and they were all different. So like, oh no, I've definitely got a list of all of the services. And then then all 3 of them were completely different. So I kind of had to just mash them all into one list and then start to figure out which ones we had and which ones were missing. In typical civil service fashion, I started kind of just with a spreadsheet, but my audit, if you like, was to go around and talk to all of the deputy directors and all of the different functions in each directorate and sort of sit down with them and say, okay, well, I think that you've got these services. Is there any off this list that I'm missing? What other ones do you have? And then talk through all of the services that we had and say, okay, well, what kind of service is this? What's the tech stack? Does it run in a browser? Is it or is it like a .exe file that runs on a Windows desktop or whatever? Trying to work out which ones were in scope of the public sector body's accessibility regulations, then working out, have you checked it against WCAG? Have you tested it with a screen reader? Have you tested it with voice recognition software? And just trying to break down what services we had and a rough punt of where we thought they were at. And that's where we kind of got to that 7% baseline from. There was a whole bunch of services where people just didn't know. They were just like, I don't even know what the stack is. It used to be a legacy system. Now it runs in a browser and we don't really know what it's doing under the hood. So it took quite a bit. I think it took about 3 months to do the audit and just actually find out, where everything was and at least get a baseline. And even now, although the list that I've got is quite extensive, it's probably still not 100% accurate because stuff's spinning up all the time and it's a bit like whack-a-mole. The next thing that I had to figure out was, do all of the people who are working on these services even know what they're supposed to be doing for accessibility? And I guess the spoiler is no, they didn't. But Emma Nickel, who's a senior researcher in DWP, helped us to survey over 200 people in different roles across digital. So we surveyed product managers, delivery managers, designers, user researchers. We just kind of went really wide. I think we got about 220 responses in total. And we kind of compiled this big sort of 26-page report analysis of what people kind of understood about accessibility. But we found that people didn't really understand what it actually meant to be accessibility compliant, and very few people actually understood the regulation. So people had heard of accessibility, which is good, but they didn't really know what having an accessible service actually looked like. 47% of people said that they had a fairly good understanding of the government accessibility requirements, but less than 10% said that they completely understood it. And I guess on the surface, we say, okay, well, nearly half of people say they've got a fairly good understanding, but when it's something which is legislatively required, is fairly good okay? Probably not. I mean, I can say, well, I'm fairly confident that I could do a security audit, but you probably then wouldn't trust me to do a security audit. So having nearly half of the people saying that they just had a fairly good understanding is probably not where we need to be if we're to consistently deliver accessible services. We also found that people didn't feel like they had access to the right support or tools. So 37% of people said that they lacked guidance, information, and training. And 53% of people said that they lacked access to software and tools. When we dug into this a bit further, the existing DWP DAC process said that you had to test on JAWS Dragon and Zoom Text. And obviously those tools are, about £1,000 a license, and trying to get them downloaded onto DWP Kit and everything's quite tricky. But we did find that actually there was this understanding that you could only test a service on JAWS, like that's the only screen reader that you can do it on, the only one that exists. And obviously that way it created this kind of barrier where people were like, well, we have access to, maybe have access to VoiceOver, we could maybe get access to something else like, we could NVDA or something of that nature, but we can't get access to JAWS and therefore we can't do anything. So that was quite an interesting thing that came out as well. The research did unearth a culture of deprioritizing accessibility. One of the things that came out the strongest was that the culture in the department was quite bad. Maybe not on purpose, but maybe just from a lack of understanding as to why it was important. There was kind of some quotes came out of the research, like it's never done at the start in my experience, it's always done at the end where it's like, oh my God, accessibility. People saying teams say accessibility is an easily disposable option. It's fiddly, it's time consuming, it's typically not seen as part of an MVP. So again, it was just sort of like, if it was too difficult, teams just cut corners and didn't do it. And then they were releasing and saying, oh, well, it's only an MVP, so it doesn't matter. But obviously if it's not viable, then if it's not accessible, it's not viable. So there's a flawed notion there as well. Essentially, we were doing agile delivery with waterfall accessibility. Because accessibility is always seen as the bottleneck, it was always kind of done right at the end. So teams were doing design and research. They were then going into build, and then about 2 weeks before the release, they would just panic and shoehorn in all the accessibility work. So we had situations where teams, if they were doing audit work, it was normally 2 weeks before they were moving through a governance gateway, or 2 weeks before they had something like a GDS assessment or something like that. It wasn't kind of getting done with every release sort of week in, week out as part of that agile way of working. So off the back of the research, we looked at trying to create a new strategy. I don't know if anyone kind of remembers in school, there was this fire triangle, but the idea behind the strategy was it resembled this, and that's kind of what it made me think of. But with a fire triangle, you have oxygen, heat, and fuel. And if you remove any one side of the triangle, the fire will eventually burn out, and that'll kind of be the end of it. And when we look at our strategy, we've kind of took the same approach. So we think compliance, culture, and education are the three main areas we want to look at. These obviously all overlap, and if you remove one, then your ability to consistently deliver accessible services will, like the fire triangle, it'll burn out and you'll kind of grind to a halt. Compliance is obviously being able to check the service against the standard and have confidence that it does meet that standard. Culture is actually understanding why it's important and actually embracing it in each phase of a project. And education obviously is just having the required knowledge and skills to actually be able to deliver accessible services. We were kind of thinking if you remove any one of these things, it doesn't work. You know, you can have the best culture in the world. You can sort of be like, right, we 100% get this, we want to do it. If you don't have the knowledge or the skills because you haven't been educated, you're not going to have any compliance services. And again, even if you have all of the skills, if your culture is bad and you don't see the point in doing it, then you're still not going to have any compliance services. So all three kind of need to work together in order to get teams to a point where it just becomes part of their day-to-day working. And I think it is common for large organizations to focus on compliance. That's where all of the risks are. And that's where the checkbox ticking comes in. But it's like asking people to pass an exam without teaching them the subject matter or them even understanding why it's important to learn that subject matter in the first place. So the next thing we had to do was kind of roadmap what we were doing. So the roadmap we put together was kind of, the idea was still thinking about that compliance, culture, and education bracket, if you like, them three things, and then looking at the work that we were doing and seeing what categories it mapped to. So the idea was to get high impact things in all three areas in each phase of the work that we were doing. So in quarter one, for example, we don't want to just focus purely on tasks which target compliance. We want to make sure we've got some stuff in there around education and culture as well. So we try and spread the work out in a way where we're trying to hit those cover off work in all of them three sections so we can move forward with the whole thing as a strategy piece by piece rather than doing all of the compliance, then all of the culture and all of the education. So we did map this out. We did map all of the different bits of work that we were doing to those things. And then originally I'd done it in Sketch, and then it became really hard to update and also was quite inaccessible. So I had to create a separate document to go with it and everything. So if you're going to do this, I definitely recommend not doing it in Sketch, but it was good for proof of concept, I guess. But one of the things that we need to ask is, if a piece of work isn't contributing to compliance, culture, or education, then why as a team are we even doing it? You know, if the strategy is to focus on them three areas and we go off and do a piece of work which isn't contributing to anything, then that's probably not a good way of doing it. So we've tried to keep everything honest to that strategy and try and ask ourselves the tough questions, I guess, when we kind of go off on a tangent. So we've moved all of our roadmap into a product called ProdPad now, which still isn't the best, if I'm honest. Like, I don't think it's WCAG compliant, which is a bit ironic in itself. But we've moved it into here just because it's a tool that DWP use and it's a way for us to get it in there. We've been looking at whether it's causing barriers. To date, it hasn't, but obviously using a non-accessible tool is a bit of a faux pas, I think. So we're definitely looking at better ways to do it, maybe move it into some kind of HTML document or something like that, just so there is an alternative format. And another thing that we look at is all of them tasks in the roadmap tie into our objective key results. So we've got 4 OKRs which we look at. One is to increase compliance, one is to improve awareness of the accessibility regulations, one is to increase accessibility related skills, and the other is strengthen the culture of inclusion. So when we look at the tasks that we're pulling in, these all try and feed into these OKRs and these sort of KPIs where we can then start to measure if the strategy is working, because otherwise, I guess we're just doing a bunch of stuff and we don't know what's working and what's not. So these are some of the kind of things that we've been looking at. So can we improve the way that we measure compliance? This fits into obviously the compliance category, but we measure compliance now across 5 things. So the legislation says it needs to WCAG 2.1 compliant to the standard of AA, and it needs to have a valid accessibility statement. But we found that some teams didn't realize that part of WCAG under section 4 of it being robust says that it has to work on a range of assistive technologies. They all missed that bit. So they thought it could be compliant without testing on different assistive technologies. So we've actually called them out and we say, okay, well, it's WCAG 2.1, and it's a valid accessibility statement, but we specifically call out it needs to work on a screen reader, a screen magnifier, and a voice controller, and you need evidence of that testing. We've built a team, so we've now got a team of 7 accessibility specialists. We've just had a senior accessibility specialist join last month called Nikki Berry, who is great. So she's leading on, she's going to be taking over the day-to-day running of the team and trying to branch out into training and stuff, which I'll cover in a second. Publishing clear documentation. So this was one of the things that came out of the research, and the intranet guidance and stuff we've stripped back to 1 page. So instead of having that whole maze in sort of circles and whatnot, we've just got 1 page now, which explains what you need to do, where you can go to get a third-party audit. It points off to our accessibility manual, which we've got a whole bunch of additional guidance in, but we've just tried to keep everything as stripped back and as simple as possible. Like, these are the standards, here's what you need to do. If you can't do it, here's a group of people that we recommend you get an audit from. Publishing usable guidance. So we've published the accessibility manual. We are constantly changing that. We're currently doing quite a big bit of work to restructure it, because it came about quite quickly, and I think it's there's definitely more stuff we can add to it, but maybe we need to change some of the categories around and whatnot, so we are working on that. But if you've not seen it already, it is just open to anyone, the accessibility-manual.dwp.gov.uk. Development training. So we've got an introduction to accessibility course, which we've run a few times. We've got a testing for accessibility course, and where our next focus is to look at designing for accessibility. We found that we bash developers a lot for things not being accessible, when actually a large proportion of the WCAG failures that we find actually rest in the design. So the developers are trying to make things accessible when the design's ultimately flawed, and they're kind of they're things that could have been addressed maybe in a prototyping stage and things like that. You know, just things like having missing hidden text on links and things like that. We see that as probably should be a content designer's job. So why, when they're doing their definition of ready, aren't they checking some of this stuff before they hand it over? And we think that by pushing everything left a little bit, that should hopefully make it easier for teams to kind of get over the line. We came up with 5 accessibility principles, which we're trying to get teams to adopt, which is, I guess they're design principles, but we got inclusion is better than empathy, accessible design is good design, start with what works. If it's not accessible, it's not done. And this is still for everyone, which is a nod to one of the existing design principles from GDS. But again, this just kind of fits into that culture category. We've published assistive technology guidance. So it'll break down, if you're using something like VoiceOver, what are the keys you need to press? What do you need to check? And sort of how do you check it? So we've started working on that, which the teams can then use. So even if they don't know how to use a screen reader, they can kind of do what they need to do to at least provide some level of assurance that it's going to work. We have set up a central SharePoint site where we store all of our evidence. So when we report on compliance, we basically say, if you haven't put any evidence in this folder, you're not going to be marked as compliant. If you've got a third-party audit, if you've done some testing yourself or whatever, and you put it in there, we can check it over and we can kind of see whether it meets the standards or not. And then that feeds into our report. So we've done a whole load of work on reporting. We report each service on those 5 things that we mentioned. So has it been tested with a screen reader, speech recognition, screen magnifier? Have you tested against WCAG, and does it have an accessibility statement? If all of those things are there, we'll mark that service off as compliant. And each service's statistics then feed into the statistics for that functional area. So a deputy director can see, okay, how many % of all of my services are compliant? How many of those are citizen facing? How many of those are staff facing? How many are categorized as sort of a very high risk or maybe a medium risk? And then all of the stats from the deputy director's function feed into the directorate statistics, which the director can look at, and then all of them statistics feed up right into the organization. So we can see from an organization, directorate function, and a service level where the compliance rate's at. And that's been really important for us, so we can see the pockets of the organization which maybe aren't doing as much work as the others. And being transparent. So now when I run the report generator once a month, it also spits out email templates, which are sent straight to the deputy directors, where it just says, you know, your compliance this month is 33%. This is an increase from 30% last month. this number of services are high risk, this number of services are low risk, and we just list out these are the ones that you need to worry about, sort of. And we send that report over. There's a whole, we can just add people in who want to receive them reports, and then once a month it spits them out as HTML templates, and I have to kind of copy and paste them into an email, but the whole thing only takes about 20 minutes, so it's definitely worth doing. So just to wrap up, I am very proud of what we've got done in 2 years, but I am absolutely knackered. I burn out regularly because a lot of this until recently has predominantly just been me as a one-man band, kind of just coding things and spitting things out and, all sorts of stuff. So I am quite proud of what we've achieved. I think there's still a whole lot of stuff to do, and we're still nowhere near where we need to be, but I at least feel like we're starting to get a handle on it now. And I think accessibility is hard. Like, large organizations wait for nobody. These things do take time. And whilst you're trying to fix them, other parts of the organization will start to derail that. The procurement, I think, as Kevin mentions, a particular problem. So you just start to get a handle on stuff, and then they roll out 4 things they've bought overnight. And it does become very much a continuous battle. But I always kind of hold on to this quote, which when I first joined DWP, I worked under a guy called Ben Holiday, and his favorite quote was just keep going. We all had stickers on the laptop that said it, and it's a quote that's kind of stayed with me, and it's a very good kind of mantra for this stuff. I think as hard as accessibility is, just keep going. We'll get there eventually, hopefully, but that is everything from me. So thanks very much for listening to me ramble, and I've went over a little bit, but hopefully that's not too big of a problem.